welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and an episode that may just be full of scandal. And we do love a scandal on this show. One of those scandals has actually unfolded before we've even begun recording because it transpires that one of our team told me that they were unwell and then confessed that the reason they're unwell is because they've overindulged over the course of the weekend. The redoubtable Provost Marshal Josh Redden joins me in the recording studio. But Josh, you're nursing a hangover. Is that your excuse?
I didn't think you were going to mention this, Zach. However, very embarrassingly, yes, that is true. But I'm feeling in tip-top shape, so I hope I'll do the interview justice nonetheless.
I'm sure you will. Talk us through the additional scandal that awaits us this afternoon.
So we are delighted to be joined by Natalee Garrett today, who is a lecturer at the Open University, whose research focuses on public opinion, the press, and social elites in 18th century Europe. But since you've clicked on the episode, you will know that the subject of our interview today is Queen Charlotte. Specifically, it's an interview based on her new book, Queen Charlotte, Family Duty Scandal, which is steaming hot off the press, quite literally. And if you want to get a copy of it, please do check out the link in the description. It's published by Routledge. Natalee, welcome. How are you?
I'm brilliant. Thank you, Josh. Very happy to be on this wonderful podcast.
We're delighted to have you. But the first question going on, I'm just interested to start at the beginning. So can you tell us about Queen Charlotte's background and early life before she became queen?
Yeah, absolutely. So she was born a princess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and that was quite a small territory, a duchy, in the Holy Roman Empire, so sort of present-day Germany. It was quite a sort of underdeveloped part of the Germanic states. They even had serfs during Queen Charlotte's lifetime. So a lot of British commentators later thought that she was a little bit backwards herself, which wasn't entirely fair. But she had a very nice upbringing. She was one of nine siblings, and she was the youngest daughter. She was a princess, as I said, so she did have a privileged upbringing, but it was quite relaxed, I think. The palace or the castle where she grew up with her family was quite modest by royal standards. I think most stately homes in Britain actually would have been bigger and more impressive than Miro Castle, where she grew up. Her education was quite good. Her parents were quite interested in giving the children quite a well education. So Charlotte was taught French, botany, history, geography, and she also learned lots of ornamental accomplishments for young ladies like drawing and dancing and singing. That sort of idyllic childhood, though, unfortunately, kind of came to an end when she was around 8 years old, and her father died quite suddenly, and it ended up that her mother Elizabeth spent many, many years trying desperately to hold on to the family's legacies and titles. Elizabeth was successful in holding on to the titles for Charlotte's eldest brother, and I think that Charlotte really saw what her mother went through and learned a lot about what she herself needed to be as a royal consort in future. So I think if we're trying to understand Queen Charlotte, the figure, we do have to go back to her childhood and her upbringing to really appreciate where she came from.
Natalee, so I'm really struck by something that you said here about how minor a kingdom it is that Charlotte's coming from, which begs the question, why is she the one who ends up marrying George III? Because particularly for our Anglo-centric audience, we sort of think about Britain in as much as Britain exists during this period, but let's park that for another 5 episodes, frankly. We think of Britain as being this big player on the world stage, and yet here you have the king, King George III, marrying somebody who's, from the sounds of things, is coming from somewhere quite kind of minor. So what's the rationale behind this marriage? What are the sort of the factors behind it being negotiated? And I guess also, how do they react to one another?
Yes, so I mean, you're absolutely right. Britain was a big global power at this time. It wasn't at its peak yet, of course, but it was definitely seen as a big player on the world stage, and Mecklenburg-Strelitz was not. Really, the main factor behind the marriage was George III himself. When he became king, he decided very quickly it was time to find a wife. That was sort of top of his to-do list. And he was really involved personally in choosing his own bride, and he had very strong opinions. He did not want a wife who was going to meddle in politics. But more practically, of course, he was the head of the Church of England, so he had to marry a Protestant. And there weren't really that many Protestant princesses of the right age in Europe. So that entered Charlotte into the sort of the competition, as it were, for George III's hand. And she was suggested personally to George III by one of his advisors in Hanover, who had sort of known Charlotte's family and had met her when she was younger. And so she was really chosen because, in the end, after months and months of negotiations, none of the other candidates were up to George III's high standards. So Charlotte kind of won the competition, and she was chosen to be betrothed to George and traveled to England, and they got married the day they met, which is a little bit crazy, I think, when we think about it, especially considering Charlotte was only 17 at the time. But she really impressed everyone with the way she behaved when she arrived in England. We don't really have her early thoughts on George, unfortunately. If she ever wrote them down, they've maybe vanished into the ether. But we do know that George was very happy with her right away. And we know that because of the diary of one of her ladies, the Duchess of Northumberland. And she actually reported on how George was behaving towards Charlotte at a ball celebrating their wedding, and how attentive and caring he was towards his new bride, which is really sweet. And George did write to his tutor and close advisor, Lord Bute, and referred to Charlotte as a treasure. So certainly seemed quite early on that George realised, his high standards had been met, and he had really found a wonderful wife and royal consort.
I just want to pick up on something else that you said there, which is the sort of sense that almost she sort of wins the competition. And there's this sort of slight sense, and maybe I'm reading too much in what you're saying here, that she's sort of identified as the least worst option. I guess firstly, is that an unfair characterization? But also, does that have any kind of implications or any bleed through, and therefore an impact on this relationship and how it unfolds?
I think your comment is not unfair. She kind of won, not necessarily because George III was in a passion for her based on what he had learned. Of course, they didn't meet before they were betrothed. But essentially, yes, she won because the other candidates had been knocked out for various reasons. One of them was interested in philosophy, which George III couldn't cope with. Another one, her father had shown strains of mental illness, which slightly ironically, of course, George III wanted to avoid. So yes, Charlotte wasn't necessarily, first place in the race, as it were. She kind of won by waiting out everyone else and sort of fitting into what George III specifically wanted. We do know that shortly before he became betrothed to Charlotte, George was very much in love with Lady Sarah Lennox, who was a beauty at the time at the court in London. But he was told specifically by his advisor, Lord Bute, that it was a terrible idea to marry one of his own subjects. So he sort of accepted reluctantly that he had to look elsewhere. He had to find a royal consort. He couldn't elevate a commoner. So I think maybe there was a little bit of reluctance in terms of George's attitude towards getting married in general. He knew he had to do it. It was his duty as king. But to be honest, the girl he wanted to marry was out of reach. So I think that maybe did shape a little bit his attitude towards his betrothal. But he does seem to have been quite positive once he decided on Charlotte. And he certainly put his best foot forward in trying to make her feel comfortable in her new life in Britain. So I think it did get off to a good start as royal marriages go. But of course, with these kind of almost arranged marriages at the time, it's not necessarily as romantic as we might want it to be in the 21st century.
It's not, is it? And see, we have a new rule on this show where I'm not allowed to rabbit hole, and that's exactly what I'm doing. But I'm really interested in what you're saying there about there are two things that are really picking up my brain here. First is, why on earth can't King George III get his head around the fact that his wife can be intelligent, and be interested in things like philosophy, and what does that tell us about him, his style of court, and many other things sort of around it? But also this thing that you've just mentioned about him not being able to marry one of his subjects. Was the concern kind of what you alluded to there about marrying a commoner, or was there more at play with this? Were there other kind of undertones about why whoever the king married needed to not be, inverted commas, British?
Well, I think the reason that he was advised against marrying a subject was slightly to do with Lord Bute himself. He was in a very powerful position, and he certainly didn't want to see Lady Sarah's family on the rise. And we of course we see that throughout history. If a king marries a subject or has a favourite even who is a British subject, then that person's family, are suddenly big political players. And I think George III understood that that could be very risky. And the kind of political balance in Britain was tricky enough. And if he was going to raise the subject up and make her obviously a member of the royal family, that was maybe going to further unbalance the aristocracy and the kind of political elite. So I think that was why. And also, of course, having some wider European connections were very useful. Of course, George III's own mother was German. I mean, his father was also German. So really, the family had deep, deep roots on continental Europe. So perhaps also it was that idea of having some connections. But George certainly wasn't concerned about marrying into a very powerful Germanic family. He did not mind that Charlotte came from quite a minor royal family in the Holy Roman Empire. He was fine with that. So lots of different factors in play, and it can be hard to understand why. But I think that's the reason why he didn't want to have a subject. He thought it was politically dangerous. And that also ties into your first question, which was why was he so obsessed with having women of a certain inclination or personality? That's a hard one to answer, I think. I mean, his younger brother actually suggested that the king was very, very happy to have a 17-year-old, a very innocent girl like Charlotte kind of under his control, was the way the king's brother later phrased it, which sounds slightly sinister. But I think George just had very strong ideas about the consort he wanted, the kind of king he wanted to be, and the way he wanted the monarchy to go. And it was important to him that he had a wife who was not going to meddle in politics the way his own mother had done for many, many years. So, kind of ironically, he was very close to his mother, but he often was criticized for that closeness. And in fact, his mother was deeply unpopular in Britain. She was seen to be someone who meddled in politics too much. So, maybe George was trying to defend his future wife in a way by making sure he had someone who was going to understand that it really wasn't her place to be involved in politics. And maybe that would be more difficult. I don't know if a woman's really into philosophy or something, maybe she's more likely in George's mind to be more interested in sharing her opinions and her political opinions, which he didn't think was appropriate. So I think that's where that came from.
Really interesting answer, Natalee. Although I see Zach's new rabbit holing rule lasted about 10 minutes. I have a question about the wider royal family, I suppose. So she's marrying King George III, but she's marrying into the most famous family in the world. And some might say it's a family that's not always welcoming to those joining it. That might be true in 1761 as much as any other year. What was Charlotte's relationship like with her royal in-laws? And I'm particularly interested in that with the Queen Mother, because George is already king, but he still has this dominating presence above him. So how did she settle into family life with the royals?
Yeah, I think it was actually really hard for, as you say, and you can imagine why it would be daunting for anybody to marry into the royal family. And even a princess like Charlotte, moving so far away from your homeland, having to leave all of your family behind and your friends, and being only 17 at the time. I mean, it is quite incredible that she was able to overcome all those difficulties. And of course, as you said, George is king. So obviously his father, Frederick, who was Prince of Wales, had died about 10 years earlier. But George's father, Princess Augusta, was really formidable. She was the most important woman in the kingdom before Charlotte showed up. So there was definitely tension between her and Charlotte, especially in the early years. And we've got great records from the diarist Horace Walpole, who recorded that actually Princess Augusta avoided paying any visits to Charlotte because she couldn't stand the fact that her daughter-in-law was of higher status than her. It really drove her crazy. So there's huge tension already. Added to that, you also had George III's eldest sister, who was also named Augusta, and she was kind of convinced for many years that Charlotte was trying to undermine her relationship with her brother, the king. So there was quite a lot of tension between Charlotte and the women in George III's family. Charlotte, I mean, tried her best to deal with this. She tried to support familial harmony by instituting family music nights because everyone in the family loved music. But I think it was really difficult for her to form positive relationships with her in-laws because of that strange political royal etiquette dimension that you find in the monarchy. George's two sisters actually ended up being married off and they moved away. So she didn't really have a chance to fix that complex relationship with Augusta. And George's brothers just seemed to run from one scandal to another. and really earned the king's disapproval for their life choices. So again, I think it would have been very hard for Charlotte to forge any kind of relationship with those brothers-in-law, considering how much they seemed to drive the king crazy. So not exactly an idyllic family that she's landed in 1761. So you have to feel a bit sorry for Charlotte in that context, I think.
It sounds like she really had to fight to establish herself within the royal family, especially under Augusta's shadow. If I can ask a follow-up on that, do we get a sense of how she coped behind the scenes with, as you just kind of alluded to, scandals there with George's brothers and obviously this strained relationship with other in-laws. So is she someone who is at all kind of likely to push back or to argue, or is she the kind of person who's just going to keep her head down and almost know when to stay quiet?
Yeah, I mean, I think Charlotte was obviously very polite and well brought up, but she wasn't a pushover either. So I think she would have pushed back a little bit if George's family were giving her trouble, but she never would have done anything that would have upset the king. And that's just a constant throughout Charlotte's life. She was always deferring to him. So if the king was on the outs with his brothers, for example, Charlotte would have followed his lead. She wouldn't have gone behind his back and tried to become friends with his brothers if they were caught up in a scandal. I think she really tried to keep the family peace. She, I don't think, would have got into arguments or anything like that with George's mother, Princess Augusta. I think she tried to kind of knuckle under a little bit when it came to Princess Augusta, which I think was probably a wise approach. But at the end of the day, Charlotte knew that she was queen. So Augusta was important. She was the king's mother, and she was certainly the matriarch of the family until her death in 1771. But before that, I think Charlotte, again being quite young, was maybe didn't really mind so much, kind of sitting a little bit in Princess Augusta's shadow and letting her run the show. And we know that when Charlotte had her first son, the future George IV, it was Princess Augusta who made all the decisions about his sort of early upbringing and when he should be fed and who the nurses and the governesses should be. So Princess Augusta, even though she had to officially defer to Charlotte, she still ruled roost in those early years. And I think Charlotte just had to kind of put up with it as best she could. I suppose that was probably the fate of many royal princesses and queens when they married abroad. You were having to fit into this quite complex family system and get used to the ropes, as it were.
Can I stay with that theme, Natalie? Because there is this kind of question that historians are always trying to knock on the door of, which is agency and how individuals get to express themselves. And from what you're saying, Charlotte sort of ends up being almost boxed into a very almost like a role that's sort of created for her. And then it kind of feels like she's expected to perform in a certain way. And there are two strands to this in my mind. One is, I suppose, is to what extent is that typical of the experience of royal consorts during this period? But also, how does Charlotte manage to make this role her own? What kind of queen does she become? But is she able to sort of exert any kind of influences behind the scene? Or does she actually just have to completely stay out of it? Because if she does start to tread on any toes, actually the system's going to come down on her like a ton of bricks.
Yes, I mean, I'd say her experience was probably quite common, but it would have maybe depended on, well, the existing structures of any monarchy, but also the family members who survived. So it sounds awful to say, but Charlotte was maybe at a disadvantage that George's mother was still alive, and that Augusta had been so powerful for so many years, because, of course, Augusta's mother-in-law, Queen Caroline, had died decades before. So Augusta was really used to being, the most important woman, not just in the royal family, but in Britain as a whole. And she was not about to give that up just because her son had married this little 17-year-old princess. So I think the dynamics of each family probably come into play. But in terms of queenship more broadly, I mean, I think in Europe, you do see kind of broad brushstrokes in the 18th century of what's expected from queens. Whether they all perfectly fall into that category is another matter entirely. But Charlotte definitely kind of lent into that idea of the queen as, of course, a dutiful wife and ideally a devoted mother if they're able to have children. Of course, Charlotte had many children. And we know that Charlotte really wasn't overtly political at all. As I said before, George III really did not want a political wife. And he really warned Charlotte off that path when they got married. And he told her, not to make friends among the aristocracy because he didn't want her to get drawn into political squabbles or factions between the sort of, broad Whig and Tory parties. So he was already kind of planting these seeds of doubt in Charlotte's mind. And she really did defer to him on all political matters. I don't think she really did anything ever to publicly challenge him politically, but she was really interested in politics and she followed a lot of political goings on in Britain and across Europe. And we know from her correspondence with her brother Charles that she often acted as a conduit for George III's political policy in Hanover, where Charles acted as governor for many years. So there were still ways in which Charlotte could be a political queen. She just had to be very careful, I think, in Britain about being too overt and kind of showing interest in politics because there just seems to have been this very widespread belief that royal women should not be involving themselves in politics. And as I said, Princess Augusta was kind of the template for what not to do. And I think Charlotte learned from her mother-in-law, don't follow that path because you just get absolutely destroyed. And Princess Augusta's public image was destroyed by the time of her death. She was really treated horribly by the British press because she was seen to have kind of transgressed those expected behaviours of royal women in 18th century Britain. So it was a really difficult tightrope for them to walk, I think, because inevitably, if you are a queen, everything you do is political. You can't really separate yourself from politics if you're a member of the royal family. And yet they can't be seen to be in any way grasping for power, or they will be seen in a very negative light.
So Charlotte is obviously she seems to be quite competent at walking this fine line of queenship where she's allowed to be a political actor in certain or to a certain extent, like for instance, like with Hanover, and she can help the king, but she doesn't want to become like her mother-in-law and kind of step too far out of line. How has she kind of got that knowledge? Maybe this is a very strange question to ask, but she came from a minor aristocratic background. Who is kind of her examples, I suppose, or who's teaching her to behave in this way, or is she just kind of picking it up on the fly and turning out to be doing a pretty decent job as far as consorts are concerned?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, actually. And I mean, obviously, Charlotte was like all princesses at the time, she would have been brought up with the idea that hopefully she was going to marry an important person, maybe not the King of Great Britain, but someone, another royal. Okay, so another ruling family she would have joined. So I suppose she would have had that sort of built into her upbringing in terms of how to behave, running households and smaller things like that. But in terms of sort of walking that tightrope of being somewhat political but not overtly political, I'm not really sure. I mean, we mentioned at the start about her mother, and obviously stepping into a very political role when she was acting as a regent for Charlotte's eldest brother. But I think before that, certainly Charlotte's mother was not particularly politically involved. And I think in terms of regency, it was perhaps okay to step in to kind of become more political because you were protecting your child. So that was maybe acceptable within those ideas of what made a good queen consort. But I think to some extent, Charlotte did also learn how to be a good consort while she was in Britain. And luckily, I think what George III taught her, it might have been a little bit harsh, but I think he did help her to be a good consort, warning her off politics, warning her away from getting involved in all the factions that existed at the time. I think he did help steer her in the right direction, even if it was for a slightly selfish reason, in that he didn't want her to be political. But I think she did learn some of it as she went along. And I think that shows very positively and reflects very positively on her, that she was able to pick up this sort of correct behavior and the expectations that were placed on her shoulders when she was so young. She did seem to get a hold of it very, very quickly. And I mean, I think she was helped somewhat by the fact that she produced an heir within 1 year of marriage, because that meant she had fulfilled probably the most important role as queen consort, which was producing an heir. So I think she got off to a very good start with the future George IV.
In some respects, it feels like very little has changed from that period that everybody talks about, which is, of course, the Tudors and Henry VIII and the Six Wives and the pursuit of an heir. But let's stay with that theme of her role as matriarch, essentially. Um, I guess that's one of the questions to pick up on. Is she a matriarch? Is she a mother figure in either the sense that she would want to be, in the way that we would kind of think of a mother figure today, or does she end up having quite a hands-off role in her children's lives? And it's worth us just flagging. She has 15 children in her lifetime, 13 of them surviving into adulthood. She must have spent the vast majority of her adult life just being pregnant. It must have been absolutely exhausting for her. How does she cope with all of this? And there's an additional question, I guess, about how does she influence the future George IV, if at all?
Well, it was really hard on her, as you would expect. I mean, 15 children is quite a lot. She was pregnant, as you say, for most of her adult life. The age difference between her first child, the future George IV, and the youngest, Princess Amelia, was 21 years. So that was 21 years that Charlotte was pregnant on and off. She did find it quite hard and quite taxing, but she seems to have been very lucky health-wise, physically, and that she was able to have all these children with fairly few complications. But yeah, she certainly overexcelled in terms of the number of heirs that she produced. And she was a really devoted mother. She was not just having children because that's what a queen consort did. She was really devoted to her children. She wanted to spend time with them. She wanted to be involved with their lives. Unfortunately, the reality was she was a queen and she was a mother. These were kind of two competing claims on her time, and she always had to prioritize her duty to the king over everything else. But even with those restrictions and expectations, she did put a lot of effort into the children's education and upbringing, and especially that of her daughters. It was traditional for princes to be handed over to male instructors when they turned 7. And so Charlotte was a bit more limited in what she could do for her young sons. And she did tend to resort to writing them very long letters, sort of advising them on how to behave well. And some of them still survive in the royal archives, and they're quite funny. Because it's just really like what any mother would say to her child today, behave yourself and don't get into trouble. It's quite sweet to see those letters. But in later life, we do see her relationships with a lot of her children becoming quite strained, especially her daughters, who ended up living with her for many, many years. A lot of them didn't marry until they were very old. But I think most of her children did really love and respect her. Um, Future George IV, if you asked about him, of course, a very important figure for our time period. And he was Charlotte's favourite child. And this is something that is commented upon by her other children. So they all know he's number one. Um, it's strange because, to my mind, George IV, or the future George IV, I should say, and Queen Charlotte had very different personalities, and they butted heads quite a lot over the years. But I think they really loved each other. And George IV kept a lot of letters that his mother had written to him, which is quite unusual, actually, because a lot of royal correspondence was destroyed when the person died. But he seems to have kept a lot of Charlotte's letters, which is wonderful. Charlotte certainly didn't approve of a lot of her eldest son's behaviours, his extravagance, the affairs and the mistresses. But I think she was quite indulgent towards him. She didn't really hold him to the high standards that she held some of her other sons to. So she did expect a lot from him. He was the heir. She knew he would be king one day. But I think she couldn't really help herself sometimes, and she was easily charmed by him. Whereas, of course, George III was very harsh on his heir, perhaps too harsh. But I think Charlotte's indulgence actually shaped George IV's character quite a bit, just as much as George III's constant criticism did. So I think both parents played a role in creating the future George IV. But he was definitely Charlotte's favourite child, and he got away with a lot that she wouldn't have put up with in anyone else, that's for sure.
The most famous thing about George III probably today is his mental state, because unfortunately in the latter part of his life he increasingly suffered from mental illness, and he was eventually so far debilitated that the Prince of Wales became the Prince Regent, and he was completely removed from the public eye. But there's another part to that, I suppose, and it's behind the scenes. And Charlotte is not only queen, but she's also a wife to George. So how does she cope with his deteriorating mental state? And as a wife, as much as anything else, I mean, it must have been really difficult for her.
Yeah, it was terrible when the king first fell ill. It was the sort of winter of 1788 to 89, and Charlotte really struggled. It was a horrible shock to her. And we have a really vivid picture of her experience during that time, courtesy of the author Frances Burney, who worked in the Queen's household. And Burney recorded the Queen, crying and pacing up and down her rooms and not sleeping. And Queen Charlotte apparently was running around, crying, "What will become of me? Now that the King is incapacitated." And she was really, really upset and really distraught. I think didn't really know what to do with herself. And of course, mental illness at the time was not understood in the same way it is today. So it was probably even more frightening for her because she didn't really understand what was wrong with the King. And at the time, no one was really sure if he was going to recover. Charlotte did regain a little bit of her confidence after that kind of initial panic. And she did agree to play a very important role if a regency was required at that point, which luckily it wasn't, because the King did recover in the spring of 1789. But unfortunately, his mental health lapsed again in 1801, which was obviously very distressing for Charlotte and the royal family because they had thought that the events of 1788 to 89 were a one-off. So it was very hard for them to see it happening again. The King recovered, but then the illness came back in 1804. And that's the point where I find Charlotte seems to have really struggled as a wife. She really didn't want to spend time alone with the King, which he took very hard. He was very offended and got very angry and essentially said he wanted to separate from her. He didn't want anything to do with her anymore. But Charlotte still remained very devoted to him. When he, as you said, of course, fell ill for the kind of final time in 1810, she stepped up and committed herself to overseeing his care with the help of the Queen's Council, who were appointed to assist her by the government. And I think she really loved George and respected him. But I think the way his mental illness presented, it made him behave in ways that were quite disturbing. And I think she found it very hard to keep up appearances, especially from 1804 onwards. Maybe that was old age on her part. Maybe it was just the repeated strain of the mental illness coming back every few years. I'm not sure what it was, but she seems to have very much drawn a line on personal intimacy with her husband in 1804. Unfortunately, that was not very well received by him. As you can imagine, he felt a little bit abandoned, but she was still very devoted to him as a queen. But I think there was a bit of a distance in the emotional side of their relationship after 1804, which was unfortunate because up to that point it had been a very good royal marriage. But the strain of the mental illness was just so much, I don't think, that they could quite overcome it and pretend that everything was fine after so many years.
Apologies for the very, very speculative question here, Natalie, but do you think some of that is self-preservation? I appreciate it's very, very hard to know what's going on in the mind of somebody 200 years after the event, but is some of that about perhaps needing to protect herself from this situation and from the chaos that is bringing to the relationship, or can we just simply never know that?
I mean, I think you're right. Of course, we can never climb into Queen Charlotte's mind and know exactly how she felt, but we do know of the emotional and physical toll that the mental illnesses took on her. She lost lots of weight. She became quite what we would call depressed. Lost interest in hobbies and really was not laughing. A lot of her friends commented on how she was like a different person after the first time the King became ill. And then I think she recovered a little bit. But that recurrence sort of in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, I think it reached a point Charlotte couldn't cope anymore. And we know from accounts of servants, George could be very cruel to her, not on purpose. Of course, this was when he was having these sort of episodes, but he told her he didn't love her. He told her he'd never loved her, that she was a terrible mother. He told her that he was going to elope with one of her ladies of the bedchamber. So Charlotte had to put up with a lot of terrible things being said to her, and sometimes the King could actually be physically violent um, to, towards Charlotte or the princesses generally, but to some of the princes and his attendants. And reading between the lines, it seems that the King was also quite, I don't know how to say it, sort of sexually forward towards Charlotte during these little blips in terms of his mental health. And I think he was like this in public, and Charlotte was very embarrassed sometimes the way he would try and maybe grab onto her or say things to her. So I think she just could not cope anymore, reached a breaking point, as you said, and she kind of had to draw back a little bit emotionally from George, I think for the sake of her own mental health, because it was so difficult to cope with him when he was going through these episodes. And it's just really sad, I think, thinking of what he went through, but also the effect that it had on Charlotte as well, which I don't think is necessarily appreciated by historians as much as it should be. You know, it's very taxing on loved ones when someone has such a serious mental illness that cannot be cured. So just a really sad situation for what had been a very happy marriage up to that point, I think.
It is, and you say that historians haven't really picked up on this as a society. We're still sort of coming to this realization that actually there is a knock-on effect for loved ones when trying to care for somebody with a mental illness, and that balance in terms of protecting yourself but also wanting to support the person that you love is a huge challenge still within society. So hopefully, with your work, we can kind of start to unpick some of that. There was another side to this that really struck me, which was the fact that George has picked her because she's not somebody who seems to be inclined to express political views and engage in philosophy and all of these things. And yet, perhaps the greatest irony of all of that is that with the regency crises, with the talk of who is going to become regent, actually there would have been quite a had Charlotte become a regent, she perhaps might not have been particularly well placed for that. Do we have a sense of how she approaches the prospect of potentially having to become regent during the king's early illnesses?
Well, she was in a slightly complicated situation because, of course, at this stage in 1788, the Prince of Wales was of age. He was in his 20s, so he could be the regent, capital letters. But because of his political affiliations, the government at the time under William Pitt weren't too keen to see him as the regent. So they suggested that perhaps the Queen could play a bigger role and she would take not control of, but responsibility for the king's person and the king's household. And that in itself, of course, was political because the king's household had political dimensions in terms of seats in government, for example. So, as you say, it's kind of ironic that George did want Charlotte to stay out of politics in Britain, but she did get drawn into it. And you see that during what's called the Regency crisis, as you said there, in 1788 to 89, where no one was really sure what was going to happen. No one knew if the king would recover or not. And Charlotte's reputation really got dragged through the mud by the Prince of Wales's supporters. They sort of portrayed her as this mother who was, betraying her son. She was grasping for power, doing all the things that a queen consort shouldn't do. And in fact, that really wasn't what Charlotte was doing at all. She was very reluctant to take any part in the regency. And the only reason that she agreed to take on that responsibility to oversee the king's care was because she felt it was her duty as his wife and as queen consort. And she agreed that it was probably in the king's best interest, even though she loved her eldest son. I don't think she was under any illusions that he was, at that point in time, the most responsible person to be looking after the king and his household. So Charlotte did step up and was willing to step up in 1788 to 89 during that first crisis, but it wasn't really something that she wanted to do particularly. And yes, I think she was really burned by the way she was treated by the political opposition, the ones who were supporting the Prince of Wales. And we have some letters that she wrote to George after he had recovered, and she essentially said that she wanted to withdraw from the public eye for a while because she had been so hurt by the accusations that were leveled against her. So I think for her, she probably came out of that crisis and realized why George had warned her off being involved in politics for all those years because it was vicious. And any woman who was seen to kind of put a toe out of line was going to be absolutely destroyed in the press. And she was, unfortunately. So it was very hard for her to kind of find that balance between being a good queen and a good wife. And I think that's a big theme in her life overall, to be honest.
This idea of the politicking in the royal family and the Prince of Wales has his supporters who are trying to undermine Charlotte's image, and Charlotte perhaps has her own supporters who are trying to kind of protect her image. It begs the question about images, I suppose, and kind of popular perceptions of Charlotte. So, I mean, over the course of her life, what were popular perceptions of Charlotte like? Was she a well-liked queen, or was it perhaps more ambivalent?
I would say she was well liked for the majority of her time as consort. The Regency crisis was not the first time that she had had a little bit of a brush with negative public opinion. She also got involved in a very famous impeachment trial of Warren Hastings. She was accused, and the king was also accused of kind of taking bribes, and he'd been the Governor General of Bengal, if I remember correctly, and he was impeached for misbehaving in that role. And lots of people were implicated, and the king and queen were also accused of kind of taking bribes. And Charlotte was sort of seen as having accepted huge diamonds and all these very fancy gifts from India to try and help Warren Hastings get out of trouble. And none of that was true at all. But that idea kind of stuck that maybe she was someone who loved jewelry, who was sort of very avaricious, so she kind of got that reputation. It filtered through her public image across the years, but I would say for the most part, she was viewed quite positively until we get to the Regency period. And Charlotte really took a massive hit as a result of the way she handled the Prince of Wales's marriage to his wife Caroline. So, very famously, catastrophic royal marriage. And Charlotte completely sided with her son, even though his behaviour towards his wife was pretty appalling at times. And the press did sort of turn on Charlotte when she was older and during the Regency period. And she was portrayed as this woman who had sort of put her husband aside. Of course, George III was living in Windsor Castle at the time and was sort of in the depths of his mental illness, and he never emerged again. So Charlotte was still queen consort, but you had the Prince Regent, who was nominally in control of everything that was going on, and yet the Prince Regent's wife was nowhere to be seen. So Charlotte ended up playing a very important supporting role for her eldest son, and some of her critics said that she had essentially tried to push her daughter-in-law out of the way so that she could remain in power, even though the king had kind of disappeared into Windsor Castle. So she had quite a complex public image, and I guess that's only to be expected. She was the queen consort for 57 years. So I think to expect anyone in the public eye to remain completely popular and well liked for such a long time is maybe asking a little bit too much. So she certainly had a bit of an up and down experience of public opinion, but she did understand the importance of having a good public image, and she was very aware of kind of being watched at all times. And you see that in her letters, especially to the Prince Regent, and how they have to handle things to make sure that the royal family don't come off looking too bad in the public eye. So it's quite fascinating, I think, to see them being so obsessed with something that we maybe think of as being a component of the modern day monarchy, the press and paparazzi and things like that. But you kind of see echoes in the way Charlotte and the Prince Regent were trying to handle their public relations, as it were.
It's really interesting that you pick up on that because as you're saying it, I'm immediately sort of thinking about the praise that is often heaped on Queen Elizabeth II for how she would handle the press at times, and then of course she is criticised for how she fails to handle the public image when it came to the death of Princess Diana. And it does make me think about how this family is plagued by scandals, or at least I feel as though it's plagued by scandals, not least the Marianne Clark scandal. And something like the Marianne Clark scandal perhaps has the scope to be something quite personal because ultimately it's her children who are implicated in these. Do we know how she feels and navigates some of these and tries to offer support, or does she reach a point where she sort of has to step back and sort of recognize the scandals as things that firstly will just happen because everybody loves a scandal and loves to blow it out of proportion, but also these kids are adults now, and so there's a limit to what she can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think she felt quite powerless sometimes, as you say. The scandal with the Duke of York was one of many, and they were adults, all of the children, really, when the main scandals happened. So it was very hard for Charlotte to tell them off. What could she really say to them at that point in time? I'm sure she was very disappointed in some of the things that they got up to, and especially her sons with all of the mistresses. Um, so many of those seem to mushroom into these massive scandals instead of being, quiet little affairs going on in the background. And of course, the future George IV was really bad for that I think Charlotte tried her best to keep them on the straight and narrow, but it was really beyond her control at that point. And she still herself worked very hard to try and manage scandals as best she could. I mean, there's one example of the then Prince of Wales, and I think it was 1795 to 96, shortly after he got married, and he was having a very well publicized affair with his wife's lady in waiting. And it really blew up in the public. And actually, Charlotte ended up being the one who got criticized for it. And the press was sort of asking, well, why is the Queen not stepping in to dismiss this woman from the princess's household and really make this problem go away? But it wasn't up to Charlotte to do that. You know, she had to sort of let her grown-up children make their own mistakes. But I think it was really challenging for her to see that happen. It must have been very frustrating because she and George III had spent so many years cultivating this very perfect family image. You know, he didn't have affairs, she didn't have affairs. That was quite unusual for royalty at the time across Europe. So they had really created this idyllic family image. They had lots of portraits painted with their children. They went out in public with the children when they were younger. And they worked really hard to make the monarchy look good. And then their children grew up and just, as you said, seemed to just run into scandal after scandal. And maybe that's something that happened across, the history of the British monarchy. Maybe it's not just the Georgians, but they did seem to get themselves in a lot of tangles. And of course, at the time, the press was on the rise. You had more and more newspapers and satirical prints and ballads being published. So there was just this appetite for scandal. And I think it did damage to the monarchy, but I think it also, in a weird way, made it quite popular with the public because they just enjoyed seeing people in the upper classes behave in these ways and being able to criticize them and maybe feel morally superior. So I think it's quite complex to think about public image at the time. But yes, I think poor Charlotte had a bit of a tough time seeing her sons and even her daughters, I guess, blowing up a little bit of what she and George had worked so hard to create all those years before.
One question I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about, Natalie, is one about Charlotte's race, bizarrely. It seems to be quite relevant today, really, because there are so many period dramas around and let's say spirited debates about casting people of color as white, as historically white figures. I'm not a great watcher of period dramas, but some people are very passionate about it. So there are some historians who have claimed that Charlotte was of African ancestry, although many more have dismissed that idea. Purely historically, is there anything behind these claims? And if not, where do they come from?
So it's quite tricky to figure out where these kind of claims and rumors came from. It seems that Charlotte did have an ancestor or ancestress who was possibly North African or Moorish, as the woman was referred to, but this ancestor lived in the 13th century. So if the connection's there, it's certainly very, very distant. And we don't really have any evidence that this was known or written about during Charlotte's own lifetime. One thing I think might have been latched onto by some historians is one comment made by a physician called Christian Friedrich von Stockmar, who actually later served Charlotte's granddaughter, Queen Victoria, and he met Charlotte in 1816 when she was quite ill. She died shortly afterwards. He was very unflattering in his pen portrait of her. And he used a phrase that we probably wouldn't really consider to be appropriate today. So I hope you'll forgive me for saying it. But he said that she had a true mulatto face. And of course, mulatto meant mixed race, essentially African and European. And I think maybe some historians have kind of latched onto that comment and combined it with that possible North African ancestry. But it's all very slender in terms of concrete historical proof. And in fact, it's actually more likely that Stockmar was using that term to sort of mean ugly. He was trying to comment on her beauty or lack thereof. And that wasn't necessarily uncommon at the time. It's pretty appalling today, but that's probably what he meant, rather than suggesting that Charlotte was mixed race. So I'd say that the evidence isn't really there to support that idea that Charlotte was mixed race or anything other than white European. But obviously, as you said, the idea has become very popular thanks to various television programs. So I suspect that the rumors probably aren't going anywhere. But for my part, I just don't think there's enough evidence to really support that claim.
I guess there's also something in the fact that this is I mean, this is my opinion here, but this is one of the great ages of caricature where any physical feature will be taken and satirized heavily. And if that was a hot topic of conversation during her lifetime, then surely it would have been emphasized in a Gilray or a Rowlandson or whoever was sort of doing a caricature at that particular moment in time. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do say that in the book, that the fact that there's really nothing about this during her lifetime is suspicious. And as you said, the caricature artists, as you know, if you've looked at any, of Gilray's works or Rolison's, they did not hold back in any way, shape, or form. I think at one point Gilray did depict Queen Charlotte topless as a sea monster. So there was really no holds barred. And the fact that none of the artists really commented on this idea that she was maybe of African ancestry does seem strange. And especially when you consider what's going on at the time in Britain and Europe more broadly in terms of categorizing, the idea of race and racial difference as we are aware of it in the 21st century. So it seems strange to me that that would not have been commented on at all if anyone at the time thought there was any truth to that rumor or even had heard a rumor. So I think, yes, the kind of the pop culture of Charlotte's lifetime also tells us quite a lot. And I think, again, points to the fact that those rumors are not true.
Yeah, I mean, this is a period of increasing racialization, and a an age in which society transitions, particularly out in India, from having celebrated mixed race relationships to vilifying them in many respects. So, as you say, that the lack of evidence and the lack of contemporary comment speaks volumes, I suspect, on that one. One thing that is particularly significant, and we always love to talk about legacies on this show, is Charlotte's legacy in the sense of she was the longest serving consort of a British monarch until Prince Philip. So how was she able to define that role and set precedents and kind of forge a legacy through that?
But I think for Charlotte, the consort role, as she saw it, was all about supporting the king. And she did that tirelessly, as we've seen, often at huge personal cost, huge emotional cost. She really deferred to George in everything. And I think she thought that was her role as queen consort. I think she also believed in protecting and supporting the monarchy as an institution. So it wasn't just about the king as a person, it was about the wider monarchy. And she was very conscious, as we mentioned before, of that power of public opinion. And she really felt that she and her family had to not only set a moral example for the British people. I'm not sure they were very successful, but she believed that they should do that. But she also knew it was important to kind of earn the affection and trust of their subjects. So I think she had a really good understanding of what it meant to be a member of the royal family. I think her legacy is a really important one. It has been totally overlooked. I mean, I guess that's probably could be said for many queen consorts in our history here in Britain, but I think she was really important because she and George III really spent half a century reshaping the monarchy and kind of bringing it into the modern era. And they did that by placing a lot of emphasis on the royal family as a concept, not just kind of involving their children in the business of royalty, but also presenting themselves as an idealized family and one that Britain could relate to and care about and maybe poke fun at as well, which wasn't their intention, but that in itself can sometimes create a weird kind of affection, I suppose. But George and Charlotte also placed a lot of emphasis on their public image. So they did things like walkabouts, which Queen Elizabeth II was kind of believed to have invented, but she didn't. George III and Queen Charlotte did that during their reign. And they also made themselves very visible in terms of patronage of charities and British culture and institutions. And obviously, those are things that are still core to the British monarchy today. So, to my mind, that's part of Charlotte's legacy. And I think she did a lot to kind of just about keep things going while the king was incapacitated. She kind of kept an even keel and maybe balanced out some of the extravagances and scandals of her children, especially the future George IV. And I think Queen Victoria and Prince Albert often get a lot of credit for, being the ones who created the modern British monarchy based on family values and patronage and manipulation of public image. But in fact, I think Victoria was very much following in the footsteps of her grandparents, George III and Queen Charlotte. So to my mind, that's Charlotte's legacy. She essentially played a role in making sure that the British monarchy survived into the 19th century, into the Victoria era and beyond. So I think it's a pretty big legacy, and she deserves a little bit more credit for what she did in keeping the monarchy going through a really complex, obviously, period of history when so many other monarchies in Europe didn't survive.
Natalie, you've been absolutely brilliant, not least because we've thrown so many curveball questions at you that weren't on the list. Our excuse is that you've been providing such good answers that just want to be followed up on, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. It was great and definitely got me thinking a lot about Charlotte and the royal family more generally. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Natalee Garrett is a lecturer at the Open University, and her brand new book, Queen Charlotte: Family Duty Scandal, is available via the link in the description. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon.
Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news from the show, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-May 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff: David Maxwell and Adam Coslin. The Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser. And in the Legion to Scholars tier, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.